I first want to thank the Lanham Foundation for inviting me. It's a great honor. It's particularly an honor to share the stage with Andrew Bacevich, as you will soon have an opportunity to observe for yourself. I want to also urge you to stop at the table for the ACLU of New Mexico, which is right out there. The ACLU has always been a necessity. It is never more of a necessity than it is now, for reasons I'm sure you all understand. So please do stop and sign up. We each come to war differently. These days, most Americans hardly notice the permanent war their country fights in the Middle East and occasionally elsewhere. But 75 years ago, a president of the United States declared that this day, December 7th, would live in infamy. The country would, FDR declared before Congress, quote, always remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. And they did. December 8th, 1941, was the last time the United States engaged in a war fought as the Constitution intended, following a vote of the duly elected Congress. Nor in its many subsequent wars has the country been able to fight through to, quote, absolute victory. The difference between 1941 and the present constitutes a large part of what Andrew Bacevich has been writing and speaking about for the past several decades. First, some basic facts. Andrew Bacevich was born in Normal, Illinois. I love it that you can be born in a place called Normal. In 1947, he graduated from West Point in 1969. He told an interviewer that as a Midwesterner, he was determined to grow east for his education. And he was just in time to serve in both Vietnam and later in Iraq. At some point, and to a civilian like myself, this came as a surprise, the Army, with real vision, decided that Andy would make a fine professor. And so he was sent to Princeton University to earn his PhD in US diplomatic history, and subsequently invited to the Point to teach history as a member of the history department. His first book, published in 1986, was not, as is the case for most straight academics, his thesis, but rather an extended essay on the military between the wars in Korea and Vietnam. It was entitled The Pentomic Era, and it focused on the lessons the military thought they had learned from the Korean War and what remained invisible to them. A few years later, he did publish his dissertation, Diplomat in Khaki, Frank Ross, McCoy, and American Foreign Policy, 1898 to 1949. That is a typical dissertation title. The title predicts for my reading of what is most crucial in his work, his understanding of the uses and abuses of military power, and his insistence on the value of diplomacy and negotiations. Above all is his warning, through books, essays, op-eds, TV appearances, of the dangers of using military power to achieve political ends. After teaching at the Point, Andy retired from the military and taught briefly at Johns Hopkins, and then joined the faculty of Boston University, where he taught until recently, holding a joint appointment in the School of Global Studies and the Department of History. He retired, but he did not stop teaching in his writing and public lectures, and more directly in an experiment in online learning called a MOOC, which translates as a, quote, massive open online course. The subject was America's Middle Eastern wars, and when it was initiated in 2014, some 9,500 students signed up. You can too. It's entirely free, and it has been archived. The succession of books Andy wrote while at BU marks an intellectual trajectory of discovery and deepening conviction. The subtitle of The New American Militarism, which has recently been reissued with an afterword, summarizes its thesis, quote, how Americans are seduced by war. Thereafter, in a succession of books, edited collections of essays, appearances on trustworthy and sadly no longer available news programs like the Colbert Report, and many, many editorials and essays in journals and newspapers across the political spectrum. And I want to emphasize that Andy Bacevich publishes across a spectrum and is inclusive in a way that's very unusual. So, from the American Conservative to the British New Left Review. And in these publications, Andy demonstrated his thesis and did something even more important. By writing his histories, Limits of Power, Washington Rules, he rejected the notion that military history and military historians were separate from American historiography in general. Excuse me, it is really very dry in this place. I should add here that his achievement did not go unrecognized. The New American Militism won the first Lanham Foundation Literary Award for an especially notable book. And In Breach of Trust, which was published just before the book we'll discuss this evening, received the American Book Award in 2014. Professor Bacevich was a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and he has held fellowships at Columbia, the Nitze School of American International Studies, the JFK School of Government, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Like the New American Militarism, each new book has a subtitle, a kind of shorthand guide to his central thesis. Thus, Limits of Power announced, and here we should probably cross our fingers, the end of American exceptionalism. Washington Rules more somberly pointed to, quote, America's path to permanent war. The subtitle for Breach of Trust was an indictment, how Americans failed their soldiers and country. My only objection to this subtitular guidelining is the very brief and I think misleading subtitle he's given to the subject of tonight's event, A Military History, America's War for the Greater Middle East. Well, America's War for the Greater Middle East, subtitle, A Military History. Because the book goes well beyond this minimal description. It is a powerful account of American society as such, from the 1980s to the present, one in which the activities of the military are made fully visible, not separate from US politics or economics, but integral to both. Andy's books combine a mordant sense of humor with a masterful command of American history. He has a wonderful way of using historical analogies to illustrate his argument in ways that are startling, illuminating, and also often chilling. His description of the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan is a good example. He begins by saying that in Afghanistan, the United States fought and continues to fight a protracted war despite the lack of any particular national interest in that country and, quote, against an adversary that, however repellent, did not directly threaten US national security, end quote. He then proposes an analogy. The war against the Taliban became an exercise in strategic irrelevance. Here's the analogy. As if in response to Southern secession, Abraham Lincoln had sent the Union Army to Brazil to liberate the black multitudes held in bondage there. Cleansing Brazil of practices, still a quote, cleansing Brazil of practices deemed objectionable in American eyes would have posed a mighty challenge without offering much by way of rewards, and so too with Afghanistan, end quote. So it just makes you think both about the Civil War and about the present. Andrew Bacevich will not allow himself or us off any hooks. Instead, he cites Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian whose resistance to the Nazis ended with his execution by them shortly before the collapse of the Third Reich. In The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer wrote about, quote, cheap grace, which he defined as, quote, unearned self-forgiveness, end quote. For Andrew Bacevich, it's what you get every time you thank a man or woman in uniform for their service or applaud them at a sporting event. America's state of permanent war has given the public, quote of Andy, a taste for cheap grace compounded by an appetite for false freedom, which was leading Americans down the road to perdition, end quote. Andrew Bacevich's writings allow neither himself nor his readers an easy escape from confronting the consequences of America's militarized foreign policy. And now it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Andrew Bacevich, who I believe is somewhere over there.
Well, I'm taken aback by such a generous introduction by my friend. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to the Lannan Foundation for this chance to speak to you. But I confess that I begin my presentation with some trepidation because I fear that we, you and I, may find ourselves at cross purposes this evening. I would like to talk about my most recent book in the hopes that it will prove of interest to some of you. I mean, it's not really all that often that I get a chance to talk to an audience of several hundred people. I suspect, however, that you, or at least many of you, will want to talk about Donald Trump. So we will compromise and do both. I'm going to make two fairly brief presentations. The first about my book, the second about offering some very preliminary reflections about the implications of the recent election. These two presentations are stitched together in the middle, and I expect that you will notice the seam when we come to it. When we get there, perhaps you will pass over it quietly, or at least suppress any inclination to guffaw. Anyway, here we go with the first talk. I've been spending a considerable amount of time of late trying to promote my book, and just about everywhere I go after I give my book talk, somebody in the audience will pose this question. Well, smart guy, what do you recommend we do about ISIS? And in some respects, the purpose of my book is to suggest that this is precisely the wrong question. And I am reminded of a situation that Marilyn will recall that we faced back in the latter part of 1967 and early 1968. Back then, the question of the moment was this one: can Khe Sanh hold? And some of you will remember, Marilyn will remember, that Khe Sanh was a Marine garrison located in the very northern part of South Vietnam, and two North Vietnamese divisions had surrounded the Marines, who were greatly outnumbered. And press commentary at that time drew fevered comparisons with another earlier battle, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, back in 1954. Back then, a besieged and outnumbered French garrison had fallen to the Viet Minh, that defeat having then deciding the outcome of the French Indochina War. Was this history about to repeat itself at Khe Sanh, with defeat there spelling the collapse of the American project in Vietnam? Well, in the event, the Marines did hold, and the United States lost the war anyway. So in retrospect, it seems pretty clear that back in the latter part of 1967 and early 1968, we were asking the wrong questions. Rather than focusing on the fate of one particular besieged garrison, the American public should have been asking questions like these. Is the Vietnam War winnable? Does the Vietnam War even make sense? And if not, why are we there? Do no alternatives exist to simply pressing on with an enterprise that even then showed few signs of succeeding? Well, I believe today that we find ourselves in a comparable situation. What to do about ISIS is a non-trivial question, but it is of far less significance than other questions that have for too long gone largely ignored. Does waging war across a large swath of the Islamic world make sense? And if not, why do we persist in such a misguided enterprise? Are there no alternatives available to the most powerful country on the planet? So the purpose of my book and the purpose of this talk is to try to call attention to these more fundamental questions. I want to suggest that answering the ISIS question requires that we first consider how we got to where we are today, which necessarily requires evaluating what prior U.S. military efforts in this region of the world have yielded and at what cost. So my book tells a story of what has become a decades-long military effort, a war for the greater Middle East that began in 1980 and is still underway today. Well, why cite 1980 as the start point? Well, in January of that year, President Jimmy Carter, certainly our least militant of recent American presidents, Jimmy Carter used the occasion of his State of the Union address to designate the Persian Gulf as a vital U.S. national security interest. In effect, a place that the United States now deemed worth fighting for. This Carter Doctrine, as it came to be known, touched off the process of militarizing U.S. policy, not only in the Persian Gulf, but across much of the Islamic world, eventually landing the United States in a state of open-ended war. Over the course of more than 3.5 decades since, a nation priding itself in having the world's greatest military, and without doubt we do have the world's greatest military, that nation has misused its military power on an epic scale. It's not simply that we have not prevailed, although obviously we have not. Rather, it is that through a combination of naivete, short-sightedness, and hubris, we have made matters worse at very considerable cost to ourselves and to others. Well, what has this war been about? In a narrow sense, it began as a war for oil. Yet even from the outset, I've come to believe, much more was at stake than ensuring access to the cheap gas that fuels the American way of life. From day one, the larger purpose of America's war for the greater Middle East has been to affirm that we are a people to whom limits do not apply. Through a war that now extends well into the 21st century, the United States has sought to validate or affirm the apparent outcome of the 20th century, widely celebrated as the American century. As enshrined in our collective memory, that outcome, the outcome of the 20th century, testifies to American global preeminence, political, military, economic, and ideological. That outcome, that remembered outcome, also asserts a claim to privileges, above all, to freedom, abundance, and security. These define our birthright, what we expect and what we think we deserve. So at least most Americans have come to believe. Well, starting with the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, both occurring in 1979, events in the greater Middle East have challenged such expectations. Following in their wake came a series of other developments, not least of all the 9/11 attacks, suggesting that the so-called American century might have been a fluke, or worse still, a fiction. So the ultimate purpose of our war for the greater Middle East has been to refute any such suspicions, a demonstration of American military prowess, thereby extending the American century into the indefinite future. Nominally, to listen to our political leaders at least, the U.S. troops dispatched to invade, occupy, garrison, bomb, or raid various parts of the Islamic world since 1980 have sought to punish the wicked, protect the innocent, and spread liberal values. Yet their actual purpose has been far more ambitious. The real mission has been to sustain the claims of American exceptionalism that have long since become central to our self-identity, to bring into compliance with American purposes the revolutionaries, warlords, terrorists, despots, or bad actors of various stripe given to defiance. To employ the kind of jargon that is popular in Washington, back in 1980, the United States set out in willy-nilly fashion to shape the greater Middle East. Well, given the conditions existing there, employing military means to bring the region into conformity with American purposes has resulted in an undertaking of breathtaking scope. Over time, it has found U.S. forces in action everywhere from Iran and Iraq, Lebanon and Libya, Somalia and Sudan, Bosnia and Kosovo, Afghanistan and Pakistan. The list goes on. Indeed, the list keeps getting longer. Along the way, we tried overwhelming force and shock and awe. We invaded, occupied, and took a stab at nation building. We experimented with counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, regime change and decapitation, peacekeeping and humanitarian intervention, retaliatory strikes, and preventive attack. U.S. forces operated overtly, covertly, and through proxies. Almost certainly, they went places and did things about which the American public, even today, remains completely in the dark. Unfortunately, no administration has ever devised a plausible strategy for actually achieving American aims. Each, in turn, has simply reacted to situations that it confronted. Nor, ironically, has any administration made available the means needed to make good on the grandiose ambitions that it entertained. Indeed, on the U.S. side, one of this conflict's abiding qualities has been its paltriness. On the home front, normalcy has prevailed. Today, who can dispute the fact that the problems besetting the greater Middle East are substantially greater than they were when substantial numbers of U.S. forces first began venturing into the region? And ISIS offers but one example of the results. We may argue over the underlying sources of those problems, but there is no arguing that U.S. efforts to alleviate the dysfunction so much in evidence have failed. Now, to address a situation that has faced the United States in the greater Middle East, Washington has had a choice of two basic approaches. The first approach is to wait things out, to insulate yourself from the problem's worst effects while promoting a nonviolent solution from within. This approach requires patience and comes with no guarantee of ultimate success. And with all the usual caveats attached, not least of all Vietnam, this is the approach the United States took during the Cold War. The second approach, the second alternative, is more direct. It aims to eliminate the problem through sustained and relentless military action. This approach entails less patience, but it incurs greater near-term sacrifices. And after a certain amount of shilly-shallying, it was this head-on approach that the Union adopted when it brought the Confederacy to its knees in the Civil War. In its war for the greater Middle East, however, the United States chose neither to contain nor to crush. Instead, it charted a course midway in between. In effect, it chose aggravation. With politicians and generals too quick to declare victory, and with the American public too quick to throw in the towel when faced with adversity, U.S. forces rarely stayed long enough to finish the job. So instead of intimidating, U.S. military efforts have annoyed, incited, and generally communicated a lack of both competence and resolve. And in the ultimate irony, the circumstances ostensibly making the Persian Gulf worth fighting for in the first place have ceased to pertain. If today, whether we like it or not, the American way of life still depends on having access to plentiful reserves of oil and natural gas, then defending Canada and Venezuela should take precedence over defending Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Even so, shorn of its initial rationale, the war for the greater Middle East continues as if on autopilot. That the ongoing enterprise may someday end, that U.S. troops will finally come home, appears so unlikely as to make that prospect unworthy of discussion even in a presidential election. Note how little attention Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton paid to our ongoing wars during the recent political campaign. Afghanistan went almost entirely unmentioned, and apart from a certain amount of posturing about ISIS, so too did Iraq. So like the war on drugs or the war on poverty, the war for the greater Middle East has become a fixture in American life and is accepted as such. Well, among the factors contributing to the lack of any serious challenge to the war's perpetuation, I think 4 stand out. The first of the 4 is the absence of an anti-war or anti-interventionist political party worthy of the name. The ongoing war has long since acquired a perfidious seal of bipartisan approval. And as such, the 2 major political parties are equally disinclined to probe too deeply into its origins, conduct, or prospects. A second reason for the war's perpetuation is that politicians aspiring to high office find it more expedient to support the troops, and therefore the war, than to question the war's efficacy. So candidates in every election since 1980 have avoided anything like a serious debate of U.S. policy in the Islamic world. True, a particular military campaign gone awry, like Somalia in 1993, or Iraq after the invasion of 2003, a particular campaign gone awry might attract attention, but never the context in which that campaign occurred. So the war for the greater Middle East awaits its Eugene McCarthy or its George McGovern or even its J. William Fulbright, a figure of national stature willing to say aloud that something is fundamentally amiss. A third reason for the war's perpetuation, of course, is that some individuals and institutions actually benefit from an armed conflict that drags on and on. Those benefits are immediate and tangible. They come in the form of profits, jobs, and campaign contributions. For the military-industrial complex and its beneficiaries, perpetual war is not necessarily bad news. Finally, however, the fourth and most important explanation for endless war is this. Until very recently, at least, Americans themselves have appeared oblivious to what is occurring. Policymakers having successfully insulated the public from the war's negative effects. In a fundamental sense, the war is not our concern. Indeed, one ironic effect of President Obama's specific approach to waging the ongoing war has been to encourage Americans to disengage by reducing the level of U.S. casualties. But here's the rub. In the actual 21st century, the prerequisites of freedom, abundance, and security are changing. Geopolitically, Asia is eclipsing in importance all other regions apart from perhaps from North America itself. And the emerging problem set, coping with the effects of climate change, for example, will require a collaborative global response. Whether Americans are able to preserve the privileged position to which they are accustomed will depend on how well the United States adapts itself to these fresh circumstances. Amidst such challenges, the afflictions besetting large portions of the Islamic world will undoubtedly persist, but their relative importance to the United States as determinants of American well-being will diminish. In this context, the war for the greater Middle East becomes a diversion that Americans can ill afford. To fancy at this point that the United States military possesses the capacity to shape the course of events there is an absurdity. and indulging that absurdity further serves chiefly to impede the ability of the United States to attend to more pressing concerns. Ultimately, I have come to conclude, ultimately, the game that matters will play itself out here at home rather than in some far-off place like Iraq or Afghanistan. Whether the United States is able to shape the greater Middle East will matter less than whether it can reshape itself, restoring effectiveness to self-government, providing for a sustainable and equitable prosperity, and extracting from a vastly diverse culture something to hold in common of greater moment than shallow digital enthusiasms and the worship of celebrity. Perpetuating the war for the greater Middle East is not enhancing American freedom, abundance, and security. If anything, it is having the opposite effect. One day, the American people may awaken to this reality, and then, and only then, will the war end. I feel a seam coming. So when I finished writing this book, roughly a year ago, that's how it ended, with a summons for the American people to recognize the folly of our war for the greater Middle East and to demand its termination. Since then, indeed just last month, the American people did speak up in ways that astonished the world. And they did this by electing Donald Trump president. I did not vote for Mr. Trump, nor did I vote for Hillary Clinton. Indeed, I was appalled that out of a nation of roughly 320 million citizens, we ended up with such flawed and ethically compromised nominees. Yet, as did many others, I did not imagine, I could not imagine, that Mr. Trump would actually prevail. And now that he has done so, we face the prospect of having as president someone who is intellectually unprepared and temperamentally unsuited for the office, someone who is spiteful, impulsive, uninformed, and devoid of real convictions. Yet what exactly does his election signify? And in particular, what is it likely to mean for the ongoing war for the greater Middle East? Well, I find it easier to answer the first question, the what does it signify question, than to answer the second one. As to its significance, the election of Donald Trump, I will posit, rings down the curtain on the post-Cold War era. We have passed from one historical moment to another one that is presently opaque, but that will prove to be completely different from what we have known. And there is no going back. Let me explain briefly. Recall how the passing of the Cold War a quarter century ago caught the American political establishment and the American intelligentsia completely by surprise. For decades, the Cold War, the Soviet Union versus the United States, communism versus the free world, had served as the main organizing principle of American politics. For Washington, it was a lodestar, a focal point, a basis of continuity. But the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later swept all of that away, leaving in its wake a sort of vacuum. Idea mongers on both the left and the right wasted no time in rushing in to fill that vacuum. And in short order, a new political agenda emerged, said to define the post-Cold War era that had now begun. And that agenda consisted of three elements. The first element, in the realm of political economy, was an unbridled faith in and enthusiasm for globalization. The second element, in the realm of culture and social relationships, was a commitment to individual autonomy. And the third element, in the realm of statecraft, was a belief in what was commonly referred to as American global leadership, but which could more accurately be termed the exercise of American global hegemony. Let me unpack each of these three elements very briefly. Globalization celebrates the triumph of American-style corporate capitalism. Its proponents argue that removing impediments to the free flow of goods, capital, ideas, and people will generate unprecedented wealth, ultimately redounding to the benefit of all people everywhere, but to the benefit of the American people most of all. In effect, globalization promises to cement the privileged position that Americans enjoyed throughout the 20th century, but especially after 1945. Their greater than fair share of freedom, abundance, and security. The push for individual autonomy, the second theme of the post-Cold War era, renders a judgment on received cultural norms and social relationships, and that judgment is a negative one. It rejects those norms as obsolete and those prior relationships as unjust. Proponents of radical individual autonomy reject constraints. In doing so, they redefine the meaning of freedom, notably so in matters relating to race, gender, sexuality, and family. I should emphasize that the passing of the Cold War did not somehow create these expectations. Feminism certainly predates the collapse of communism by many decades, and the gay rights movement didn't begin with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But once the Cold War ended, issues such as these moved from the periphery of American politics to the very center. And demands for change acquired an urgency and momentum that they had never possessed before. As for the third theme in the post-Cold War era, with elites now explicitly referring to the United States as the sole superpower and so-called indispensable nation, expectations of what history was summoning America to do increased exponentially. And fulfilling history's providentially assigned mission gave rise to pronounced activism. The hallmark of U.S. policy in the post-Cold War era soon emerged in the form of a greater willingness to employ armed force. During the Cold War, the principal, if by no means sole, rationale for maintaining an immense and costly military establishment had been to prevent World War III. The U.S. maintained bases and garrisons around the world to defend and to deter. Since the end of the Cold War, however, rather than defending and deterring, successive administrations have demonstrated an enthusiasm for putting U.S. military power to work. Policymakers and pundits have promoted the use of armed force as an instrument to solve problems. Well, I believe that the election of Donald Trump represents a powerful, popular backlash against each of these three post-Cold War themes. By electing Donald Trump, who ostensibly holds the political establishment in contempt, Americans have renounced all that the widely despised establishment has wrought during the post-Cold War quarter century. Americans hurt by globalization, and there are more than a few, reject its premises. They called for restoring economic self-sufficiency. Doing so, they believe, will provide people born and raised in this country with steady jobs that pay well. These neo-populists want to prioritize the interests of working stiffs over the interests of the moneyed classes. Americans distressed by freewheeling, infinitely flexible social arrangements believe that something fundamental has been lost since the days when Ozzie and Harriet defined the ideal American family. And perhaps I'm pressing the point further than the available evidence will go, but it seems to me that more and more Americans, both on the left and on the right, maybe mostly old people like me, have an inkling that something is amiss when digital connections supplant direct human ones. Finally, at least some Americans are awakening to the fact that perpetuating unwinnable wars is a dumb idea, even if authorities in Washington seem slow to own up to that reality. And they are increasingly hard-pressed to understand why U.S. forces should remain in perpetuity in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. These Americans, I think, are likewise increasingly disillusioned by the manifest contradictions inherent in U.S. policy. Many of you may have seen the report in today's New York Times about Saudi Arabia. For years now, the Saudis have been playing both sides of the fence in Afghanistan. Nominally supporting the Afghan government, they have at the same time surreptitiously funded the Taliban. Our ostensible ally in a war against terrorism, the Saudis have simultaneously promoted the most extreme and intolerant form of Islam. And you don't have to be a Trump supporter to wonder why, at this stage of the game, the United States classifies Saudi Arabia as an ally. My point is this: by voting for Trump, Americans were repudiating each of the three themes that defined the post-Cold War era. Granted, Trump himself does not seem particularly well-suited to champion the interests of the working class. Ditto for promoting the restoration of traditional family values. On that score, the thrice-married serial abuser of women seems somewhat miscast. And as for advocating a more pragmatic, less ideological approach to foreign policy, Trump's penchant for shoot-from-the-hip bellicosity should give anyone pause. But intuitively gifted demagogue that he is, Trump tapped into popular angst and anger related to these three core issues. And that anger turned out to be far more widespread than observers, myself very much included, appreciated. Today, as Marilyn mentioned, marks the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. The date that FDR said will live in infamy tipped the United States from one historical era into another era that was completely different. And I think something similar will occur next month, on January 20th, when Trump takes the oath of office. It will fall to Donald Trump to provide some definition to this new era that we are entering. It will be up to Trump to chart an azimuth. Well, what can we expect? Well, for starters, his supporters are counting on him to disestablish the establishment, to drain the swamp, to teach American elites humility. Will he do so? Will he even make the attempt? Does Trump have even a half-realized conception but the country's future direction? My preliminary answer to those three questions is no, no, and no. In that regard, members of the establishment can take comfort in Trump's initial appointments. Billionaires in the cabinet, generals running the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and the National Security Council. I have to say my absolute personal favorite is the wife of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell becoming Transportation Secretary, keeping it in the family. So rather than turning the establishment out as his supporters expected, Trump is merely populating his administration with figures drawn from the right wing of that establishment. True, Trump's appointees tend to be agenda-driven ideologues, but their agendas do not accord with populist expectations. What do these appointments suggest with regard to the policies likely to define the post-Cold War era? Here it seems to me the lack of any overarching vision on the part of the man at the top is likely to matter. On matters of political economy, Trump sees himself as a deal maker. He fancies that he can cajole, browbeat, or coerce others, whether U.S. corporations or foreign governments, into doing his bidding. And the much-hyped carrier deal gives us a hint of his intended MO. But Trump offers no plausible alternative to globalization. Low-wage and underemployed workers who think that Trump's Make America Great Again slogan is going to bring back jobs sent overseas in recent decades will be sadly disappointed. And when it comes to culture and social arrangements, Trump will likely prove indifferent to the issues that agitate his constituents. The pro-life stance that he assumed when debating Hillary Clinton was a convenient posture, an example of naked political opportunism. Reversing the revolutionary tide that has dramatically redefined what is allowed and not allowed, required and prohibited on matters related to gender, sex, sexuality, and family will consume far more political capital than Trump will prove willing to expend. On such issues, Trump is a pseudo-conservative. And truth be told, so too are the great majority of Republican office holders. Trump's supporters, who expect him to restore the norms that prevailed, or at least enjoyed lip service, prior to the 1960s, are likewise in for a big letdown. When it comes to foreign policy and to the perpetuation of America's war for the greater Middle East, my own particular preoccupation, Trump has not conveyed even the slightest appreciation of something rising to the level of providing the basis for a strategy or a doctrine. When it comes to statecraft, he is, in a literal sense, clueless. To the extent that Trump responds to the guidance of Islamophobes, such as Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who will be his national security advisor, well, I think we can expect America's war for the greater Middle East to continue indefinitely, perhaps even to escalate further. Meanwhile, Trump's supporters, their sons and daughters bearing the burden of military service, may be weary of war. But Trump's advisors are not. And they make no pretense of seeking an escape from war except through total victory. You know, my calling is history. I'm supposed to explain the past rather than to make predictions about the future. But if I had to place a bet on where this first round of the post-Cold War era is headed, here's what I would say. Trump is not going to deliver on what his supporters expect. And his failure to do so will redouble their anger. The very anger that handed him the keys to the White House. And that's when the real crisis of American politics will make itself felt. And it's likely to be much, much uglier than anything we've seen to date. We're headed, I'm sorry to say, into some very troubled waters. Thank you very much.